The fog rolled in thick that night, swallowing the small coastal town in a ghostly blanket. Allison had always loved the eerie beauty of foggy nights, but tonight, something felt wrong. The air was too still, and a strange silence clung to everything, as if the world had stopped holding its breath. She had recently moved into an old, weathered cottage on the outskirts of town, surrounded by the moors. The locals had been friendly enough, but oddly vague when she mentioned her new home. They never seemed to meet her eyes, simply muttering warnings about the fog and how it wasn't wise to wander after dark. Allison brushed off their warnings, assuming it was just superstition. After all, what harm could a little fog do? That evening, she decided to take a walk along the cliffs. She wrapped herself in a thick coat and set off, the chill in the air biting at her cheeks. The trail was familiar, but tonight it felt different. The fog twisted in unnatural ways, curling around her legs and creeping up her spine. She could barely see more than a few feet ahead of her, but she pressed on, convinced it was just her imagination playing tricks. As she walked, the silence grew heavier, broken only by the occasional distant crash of waves against the rocks below. But then, she heard it. A soft whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. She stopped, straining to listen, but there was nothing. Just the wind. She shook her head and kept walking, quickening her pace when she heard it again, this time closer. It was as if someone, or something, was calling her name. Allison. Her heart pounded in her chest. She spun around, expecting to see someone emerging from the fog, but there was no one. She was alone, or so she thought. Allison. The voice was clearer now, almost right next to her. Panic set in. She turned back toward the cottage and started to run, the fog seeming to thicken around her, making it hard to breathe. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more insistent. She stumbled, her foot catching on something unseen, and she fell hard onto the damp ground. Allison. She scrambled to her feet, her hands trembling. The whisper wasn't just in the air anymore, it was inside her head, echoing, repeating her name over and over. In a frenzy, she bolted down the path, the fog now so thick it felt alive, clutching at her as she ran. She could see the faint outline of her cottage in the distance and pushed herself harder, desperate to reach the safety of its walls. But just as she reached the door, the whispers stopped. The air was still again, and the fog seemed to retreat slightly. Panting, Allison stood frozen, hand on the doorknob. She dared to glance back. Standing at the edge of the fog was a figure. Vague and indistinct, it hovered just out of sight, its features obscured by the mist. But its eyes glowed through the fog, staring at her with an intensity that chilled her to the bone. The whispers returned, but this time they were clearer. Not one voice, but many. You shouldn't have come here. Allison. The figure took a step forward. With a scream, Allison threw open the door, slammed it behind her, and locked it. She backed away, eyes glued to the window. The fog pressed against the glass, swirling violently, but the figure had vanished. She collapsed onto the floor, heart racing, trying to catch her breath. The cottage was quiet, too quiet. And as she sat there, she realized something horrifying. The whispers were inside the house now, and they were getting closer.